Thank you all so much for this great talks. I'm sure I'm going to ask a question that everybody has here. Can you tell us, each one of you, what your typical day eating is like?
Yeah. Good question. Oh no, you start.
Just in time.
What was the question again?
What's your typical day of eating?
Typical day of eating. Oh gosh. At home or here. So coffee with cream or MCT, coconut oil. Maybe eggs in the morning. Maybe go out for fajitas for lunch. And then maybe no dinner. So maybe once or twice a day.
Okay, mine is boringly similar from day to day. I have a bulletproof drink in the morning, and then somewhere around 10:30 is when I eat breakfast, unless I'm out hiking. In the summer, the morning is the best for hiking. I'll eat, if I'm hiking, I eat my first meal at around 1 instead. And in the summer, I eat dinner a little bit later, but usually lunch consists of some kind of protein, chicken, most likely, or leftover or whatever from the night before. Vegetables, I do eat vegetables, I like them. And I eat a little bit of fruit. And dinner looks amazingly like lunch, and is I try to leave at least 4 hours between my last meal and bedtime. I really feel a lot better when I have that that space in there. Here, it's just anything goes.
This is a strangely hard question for me. My meal patterns have been swinging around in different ways, but I start the day with electrolyte juiced water and usually go off to a hot yoga class. And I often end the day with sparkling water, sometimes with heavy cream in it. Surprisingly good drink to put like a quarter cup of heavy cream in a big thing of sparkling water in a beautiful, stem glassware. And so that's a nice boost. Sometimes after a yoga class, I'm really hungry for electrolytes, so sometimes I'll mix some raw milk with some cream, heavy cream, and some coconut water, and that just makes me feel good. I don't know if that's related to the oxalates or not. And then I roast a lot of meats. I buy my meat from local farmers and usually buy the whole animal, often splitting it with friends and clients. So I have a freezer full of meat. I love to roast pig skin with the fat on. So I cut this pig skin with a 1/4 inch of fat, and I roast that slowly in the oven for a couple of hours, and then you turn up the heat at the end, and it turns the skin into this bubbly cracker, and the fat underneath it is this, the flavor of pie crust, salt. So anyway, those are. It's not the whole meal thing, but you saw some pictures of some of the food I eat today if you heard my talk.
Usually, if it's a work day, I'll pack a container of some diced meat that, like leftover steak or roast or whatever. And, and that's pretty much it. I've been almost carnivorous for a while, and I finally took the plunge toward the beginning of the year. So that would be lunch, and then dinner would be maybe, again, some kind of roasted or stewed. We'll do chuck roasts and then shred them up, and then you have that shredded meat in the freezer or fridge. Cook up some ground meat ahead of time, and then just pull that out, and that heats up pretty easy. So those are the sorts of eggs, but I'm heading to work pretty early, so I'm not going to be rattling pans and cooking and making a mess. Anything that's easy to throw together and take to work in an ice bag, and that's pretty much it.
So on a typical day, I usually wake up and have 1 cup of coffee. I've cut myself way back. I'm now down to just 1 cup a day. And then I have usually just a little bit of fruit
maybe sometime in the mid-morning. I don't typically get hungry very early in the day, so I'll maybe have a little bit of fruit after the coffee. And then usually lunch is I like to make it a big green salad, usually with leftover protein from the night before. If we had fish, I'll throw that in, or tuna, or something like that, just to give it a little bit more calories. And then for dinner, it really varies. So I'm the mom of 2 little girls, and I have a husband that I'm also cooking for too. So I'll typically make a big meal that really kind of accommodates a little bit of what everybody likes, and then we all can kind of pick and choose. And also that way I can set a good example for my girls with being exposed to different types of foods. But we like to eat lots of ground lamb dishes. We'll often have hamburgers, try different types of fishes, different types of seafoods, and then always leave some vegetables and things like that around too.
My diet is almost, I would say maybe it's 80 to 90% animals, so seafood, poultry, red meat. So breakfast and dinner look very similar to each other. So I might have a duck or salmon or fresh sausage for breakfast, and I might have fish or beef or lamb or something for dinner. And sometimes I eat lunch, sometimes I don't. Depends on my work day. Ideally, my metabolism the rhythm seems to like eating around 10 and then eating around 4. If I eat later in the day, it doesn't seem to suit my rhythm as well, but sometimes that's what happens. And on those days, I will eat 3 times a day. I do sometimes include a few plants in my diet, the ones that don't seem to bother me, but I think everyone is different in this regard. But I don't eat them because I think they're good for me. I eat them because they add a little variety to my diet, and it makes it a little bit less limiting because I have a lot of food sensitivities. I don't eat eggs or dairy or coconut or nuts or anything like that because I don't tolerate them. So my diet doesn't look that interesting, but it does help me to feel better.
Interesting that none of us really talked about spending our days in the kitchen making gourmet meals.
I pay other people to do that.
How much?
So I grew up as one of those little boys who didn't like to eat his vegetables, but I did like milk and dairy. And I was pleasantly surprised as a keto advocate now to hear how plants got pretty heavily bashed in this conference. I didn't expect that. So my question regards lactofermentation. Is there any, as far as any of you are aware, is there any indication that the process of lactofermentation with regard to plants can reduce the oxalate quantity, and with regard to dairy can reduce the, what do we call them, estrogen metabolites?
As far as what's been tested, fermentation's not going to help with the oxalates, and pickling may make oxalates worse. If it starts to have, in particular pickled beets, the acid from the pickling process increases the solubility of the oxalate, so it's much more bioavailable, and effectively it more than doubles the dose that you're more likely to absorb. So you want to start with low oxalate vegetables. I think fermentation is a way of, kind of like the cow has this pre-digestive chamber. It helps the digestibility of vegetables a lot. But fermented green beans have been tested, and it doesn't seem to be helping at all.
Regarding the question about the estrogen metabolites, I have no reason to believe that it does eliminate that. There is technology that's been developed that could do it, but to patent it, get it out there on a large scale, the fellow that I talked to said he didn't think it would be economically feasible, and I think it will be, but if I win the lottery, maybe I will support that.
Great, thank you.
If I could make another quick comment about fermentation that some people may not be aware of, is that when a protein is fermented, for dairy protein, for example, the bacteria transform the proteins and can, in some cases, especially in aged products like hard cheeses, for example, create biogenic amines, which some people are sensitive to, particularly if you have any gut damage issues. You can have some problems what's the word I'm looking for? You may absorb more of that histamine into your bloodstream than you otherwise would if you had a healthy gut, because the enzymes that degrade the histamine are compromised. They come from the healthy cells that line the gut. So if you have any gut damage, you may not do as well with aged and fermented and cultured foods, and that was one of the issues that I eventually came to understand about myself. That's not true for everybody, but it is true for some people to be aware of fermented foods.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm piggybacking a little on that. Have already talked to a few of you, but I just like kind of a general consensus on how to go about doing this. That for my daughter with mental health, maybe doing kind of an elimination diet sort of thing. And I have to admit, even though keto helped a lot of gut issues, I'm not 100% happy with the way I feel, grain elimination, sugar elimination. So how to go about maybe finding out if it's some of the vegetables that I'm sensitive to and kind of what order to do that sort of thing in general for everybody.
So my general recommendation is that there are two different ways of doing this. So in order to try to figure out which, let me back up. So plant foods are the most likely culprits in the diet for the reasons that we've talked about this weekend. It doesn't mean that you can't have sensitivities with animal foods, particularly fermented, aged, cured, smoked animal foods. Those are triggers for some people. There are also fish and is one of the common culprits for people with food sensitivities and allergies, so that for some people is an issue. But all that set aside, if you're trying to figure out which plant foods might be bothering you, the fastest way to do that, if you're an all or nothing person, is to take them all out and then work your way back. I feel like an all meat diet, by which I mean seafood and poultry included, is sort of the ultimate detox diet because you're removing all the plant toxins all at once. But some people are more of a one at a time. A one at a time approach is less overwhelming and less difficult. So you could just take out one group of plant foods at a time and work your way down. And so those are the two different ways that you can do it. I don't think there's any particular order. I mean, as I was saying, that I think the seed foods, grains, beans, nuts, and seeds are some of the most potentially toxic ones. And if you had to pick one group to focus on to begin with, if you only wanted to do one at a time, that would be a good place to start. But you can really do it any way you want. And you know, some people, even if they went to all meat, might not feel their best. But a lot of people, and there's a growing online community. There are some wonderful Facebook pages and doctors out there who are and websites about carnivory. Sean Baker, MD, has started World Carnivore Month this month, January 2018, and he's available online for support and questions, and he's gathering data. Amber O'Hearn's excellent site speaks a lot about it. And Zeroing In on Health and Zero Carb Zen are also excellent sites on the internet if you're curious. Anybody else want to talk about that?
Yeah. You have something? No. Some suggestions if you want to zero out the vegetables and where to start, what things to bring in. I would consider trying low oxalate vegetables like turnip, maybe some rutabaga, celeriac, which is celery root, and just, you know, one at a time. Make sure your vegetables are well cooked. Okay, no, raw vegetables are ridiculously hard, useless to digest, so cooked. And then wait to do fruit vegetables. Anything that's got a seed in it, they're also high in lectins, and so lectins are really bad news for your gut too. But that might be a place to start, and be sure to get enough fat with vegetables. And generally, I think heated, warm foods and pureed foods are pleasant and comforting and improves the digestibility just because of that.
Could I ask if the tendency to get, you know, the little kind of stinginess on your side of your tongue when you eat certain things, is that a sign of anything? It's usually like strawberries.
There's something called oral allergy syndrome.
Right.
Where you get mucosal responses to certain foods, particularly raw ones, because those enzymes are still active. And it's really about the active enzymes. So if it's, you can tell if it's oral allergy syndrome because if you eat a cooked carrot and it doesn't bother you, and then you eat a raw one, it does. Also, oral allergy syndrome can be kind of intermittent. Like sometimes you ate a carrot and it was fine, another time it wasn't. And I don't know if that's you, the host, or the carrot, but there's something weird about that. So that's not too unusual. The classic description of that condition is it comes from birch allergy and sort of is the set of things that have the similar antigen. They're totally unrelated plants, but they share the antigen that latex has. So if you have a sensitivity like the latex and Band-Aids or something like that, you may end up with this oral allergy syndrome.
Particularly with avocado, that's a
Yeah.
big one. Kiwi's another.
Yeah, I have it, so I know a lot about it.
Okay. All right, thank you
Can't
so
have
much.
avocado.
And unless there was somebody else, gonna?
Just one other thing is that the plants that contain tannins, and tannins are very widespread in the plant kingdom, like black tea, grape skins, red wine, things like that. Foods that are high in tannins also sort of give you a puckery, astringent feeling in your mouth, and foods that are very high in tannins can give you a strange sensation. I don't know if that's part of what you were asking, but.
Could be.
I'm good. Really? Yep. Okay. So, Georgia, I missed that. When do you have that big salad during the day? I have a few questions. So, who up there has anything in the way of raw meat or cares to admit that they have some raw meat? And what do you have, Sally?
Oh, I love raw meat.
Is it regular, or is it a treat, or you sneak it someplace?
I have many ways to do it. I've developed and collected lots of organ meat recipes and lots of raw meat recipes. One of my favorite ways to do raw beef is to chop up ginger and dill, fresh dill, and I have like 4 or 5 spices, and then you sort of pack the meat in that for at least 24 hours, and then you slice it fresh when you're serving it.
Nice.
And it's got lime juice on it, and I love raw meat. Yeah, it's the most digestible thing. The raw egg yolk is the most digestible thing. And
So
then,
beef tartare would be perfect, right?
Yeah, you and I could dine together.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. No, I have to kind of jump around.
No, yeah, I was just saying, maybe just you can circulate around the
Okay.
have a chance with you. Welcome to keep.
Okay, we'll do that.
My question centers around fiber, and in particular, when we think about the amount of carbs in a keto diet, should we look at net carbs or total carbs? And is there any amount of fiber that I should target a diet for? And we talked with Eric yesterday, and I saw Miriam had total carbs on her slides, and so I'm a little bit confused. And maybe also just for me to clarify for me, does fiber lead to an insulin or increase in blood sugar?
Yeah, that's a great question. So traditionally, the teaching of low-carb doctors, the 1900s through 2000, always used total carbs. Then for you true trivia geek in the low-carb world, Mike Eads claims the responsibility for coming up with the idea of net carbs. You can go to the Protein Power website, proteinpower.com. So the idea was that if the fiber didn't impact the blood sugar, then you could subtract the fiber out of the total carbohydrate grams, and then you get the net grams. Well, that kind of morphed into, what about sugar alcohols? So we'll just subtract those out too. And, sugar alcohols don't impact the blood sugar, so we don't have to worry about them. So some people didn't subtract sugar alcohols, some people did. So there's no general consensus. In fact, if you look at a food label in Europe, the total glycemic amount in there is actually that amount subtracting out the fiber. So it's very confusing. So in order to reduce confusion, which is what I need to do with patients who come to me who are often confused, I like to reduce confusion. I will assume that some people might absorb fiber, because some do, and assume the worst and use total grams. And that's what the doctors did through the last century who were using this in a clinical setting. Now, adding in the net grams calculation allows you to have food products that are technically low in carbs, net carbs, but I find some of those products are problematic. They have other effects on people. They make them hungry, they give them diarrhea, and then they blame the diet for it when it's really those products. So the safest thing for me, someone coming to me, the guru on the mountain, use total carbs, or if someone has problem in the area, they have problem, use total carbs. It erases a lot of the other extraneous things that can be in there. Truth be told, nobody knows the role of fiber in the human diet, and I think fiber is overrated. And all of the studies, high-level journal, medical journals with randomized trials giving fiber versus other groups that don't have the fiber, there's really been no benefit shown. So if you look at epidemiology, case studies, animal studies, you'll hear fiber, 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 and then you look at randomized controlled trials in humans, it's gone. There's no effect, no beneficial effect. But then what would you buy if there was no? So anyway, that's the long story from my perspective.
Let me clear something up. I didn't mean to indicate on my slide that those were total carbs. I do, when I'm giving recommendations, I give for net carbs.
Right, you had net carbs.
Okay, all right.
Eric had talked about total carbs. You talked about net carbs.
Yes. And if I suspect that somebody is having a glycemic response to fiber, they should test it. I do know of somebody who does get a reaction to one fiber, I forget what it was. And then fructooligosaccharides, which are used in a lot of power bars and things, can raise blood glucose, so gradually they've been taking those out. And my advice to people is, you know, if you're buying a product, a bar or something, and it has more than 6 grams of fiber in it, be aware of that for a lot of reasons, not just for its effect on glucose. I don't think anybody needs to do that.
Miriam, you mentioned winning the lottery. If you could have one all expenses paid randomized controlled trial that you didn't have to justify to anyone, what would you test? And this is for everyone.
For everyone?
No, I mean everyone can answer this,
okay.
please.
Okay, good. They'll have other things I can stick to cancer then. I would like to see a trial that that goes on for a long, long time and tests all different combinations of things that people have found to be beneficial along the way. I mean, we could eliminate some of the snake oil right off the top, but boy, there's care oncology that combines metformin and a statin drug. This is for cancer, not for cholesterol. An antiparasitic and a antibiotic. And it's extending life in people. Overall survival is longer in glioblastoma and probably in other cancers as well. So I would be looking, and I don't know what the specifics would be, but I'd be looking at combination therapies that will actually knock the cancer out, just not just knock it down. And I know Dr. Seyfried is working on something that will shut down glutamine, because that's the other big issue with cancer cells, is they feed on glutamine. So that's another reason why I would not be upfront about having somebody that I'm working with eating mostly protein, between that and the stimulation of mTOR. I know they're doing that in Hungary, and it's working, and that's amazing. But I'm not there yet in my thinking. So this trial would be to find combination therapies that would actually knock out the cancer cells, even down to the cancer stem cells.
Yes.
So we're all talking about our favorite research fantasy?
Yes.
In the oxalate world, we need a lot more bench science before we can do real fancy clinical trials. But there are some real simple things we could do. We could take population groups that have carpal tunnel, Give me 500 carpal tunnel patients and put them on a proper, real low oxalate diet and follow them for 10 years. And all these other syndromes, sleep disorders, back pain, arthritis, GI problems, kidney problems, like really, really teach people what a real low oxalate diet is, help them actually do it, and follow them for a long time. My real wish, though, is to understand the physiology of the tissue clearing of oxalates and how we can make that better. I mean, there are some things we do with nutrition and stuff and so on, and there is an enzyme coming out, as I mentioned before. I wonder, my fantasy is to be able to inject that enzyme into these sites of deposits and just vaporize the stuff in the body, and then you can just give somebody a fresh new body. It'd be awesome.
Mine's going to be real foragey, geeky. There's a lot that we don't know about fiber digestion. We've developed some new tools, and I think I talked to you about one of those. But the problem in animal nutrition, as it is in any nutrition, is you have to estimate what the value of the food is before you feed it, and then see how it performed. And that's been a challenge in forages. Forages are one of the most variable of feedstuffs. So it's going to have something to do with that, and the goal is going to be to see just how much energy we can end up supplying from digestible fiber as opposed, and replace as much digestible sugars and starches as possible out of the feed, and still achieve economic return and have a viable enterprise.
I have one.
Thank you.
So this is easy for me because it'd actually be a dream come true to not have to go around begging for money and writing grants all the time. And we have a trial that we're actually trying to raise funds for right now that is investigating a new treatment that we've discovered for a combination therapy to treat addictive overeating. And so what I would love to be able to do would be to raise the funds so that we can see that through. And the thing that's really interesting about the combination of drugs that we've put together is that they're both FDA approved for other reasons. But when given in combination, we find that they are able to reduce intake of the highly palatable foods, so the high sugar foods, but they have no effect on regular food. So we seem to have stumbled upon something that seems to specifically target the hedonic eating system. So by being able to potentially, dampen that to some extent, it may be helpful for people who struggle with addictive overeating. So we'll see.
Cool. Does it involve naltrexone, Topamax, or Vyvanse?
Very close. It's the combination of baclofen and naltrexone. So baclofen is a drug that's a GABA A agonist, and naltrexone is an opioid antagonist. And so, these drugs have been on the market for years, are used for other purposes. They have been found individually to really not have much of an effect on food intake, but we found that when we put them together at certain doses, they are able to reduce the intake, like I said, of the highly palatable foods. So we find that to be really exciting.
The last remaining vestige of bias against low-carb diets is, in the medical world, is the heart disease issue. So we know that with 200 people with diabetes and heart disease, these are very high-risk people, they're likely to have another heart attack soon. So if you randomize 200 people, 100 per group with diabetes, heart disease, usual care versus keto, 2 years will probably find a benefit of the keto diet given what we suspect. So that would be the power calculation. You'd have an endpoint of death and dying in heart attacks, which would persuade the medical community or show that it actually harms us.
Right. Sounds good.
So for people who don't know, that's Amber O'Hearn. You can ask her about carnivory. I love this question. So here's my dream. My dream is that we take, I don't know how, a large enough number of people to make it interesting, maybe 500 or 1,000 people, just middle-aged adults, 30s, 40s, 50s, and full health questionnaires, including psychiatric symptoms, not just LDL and triglycerides and blood pressure and blood sugar, but skin health, digestive health, mental health symptoms, sleep, pain. Sort of do a full physical inventory and then enroll them in, sort of randomize them into 2 groups. Oh, by the way, all of these people would currently be on kind of a standard junkie diet, nothing special. And then randomize them into 2 groups. One group would be, first put them all on a whole foods, omnivorous, pre-agricultural diet. So it's kind of like a paleo diet for, I don't know, a month or so, or maybe even just a couple of weeks. And then split them, survey them again and figure out if they're doing better or worse, and then split them into 2 groups again, or for the first time actually. They're all in the, I'm inarticulate because I'm so excited. So, so you take this entire group of people who've just gone from a junkie diet to a paleo diet, say maybe for 30 days, and then you find out if, how their health has changed, better, worse, the same. And then you randomize them into 2 separate groups, one a whole foods vegan diet, the other a pure carnivorous diet, for maybe ideally, I can have as long as I want, 3 months, and then see what happens to all aspects of their health. I think they'll be fascinating and would answer a lot of questions, or maybe even raise some interesting questions. I don't know what the answer would, I don't know what the outcome would look like. I would be just on the edge of my seat the entire time. So,
Thanks for indulging that. I'm looking forward to them all.
Buy your tickets.
Thanks. This is mostly for Dr. Edie and Dr. Kalamian. So to be sort of maybe an angel's advocate, there are a lot of dealing with cancer patients and stuff. And therapists that have historically had some success using things like juice, vegetable juicing to treat cancer. So, they may have had some results. So now, one of my ideas that popped into my mind, and anyone can chime into this, is that perhaps these phytotoxins that are in the plants, if we change the word from phytonutrients to phytotoxins, and then maybe in these patients, these cancer cells are damaged cells, and these oxalate and other phytonutrients that we have yet to look at actually end up accumulating in those cancer cells and somehow preferentially kill the cancer cells, and somehow they got the result despite the fact that they're not doing everything else that we've talked about today. So that's why I said sort of an angel's advocate to sort of bridge this these outlier cases of patients, because I know a lot of patients do all kind of juicing and they don't get any results except for getting sick, but some patients seem to do well and they do get some remission. So I just had your thought on that, and maybe it's another follow-up question. Maybe this is another area of research to look into. So.
I think a lot of times when people get a diagnosis like cancer and then they start something like a Gerson
Extreme,
therapy.
yeah.
Yeah. They're coming from a really horrible diet, so any change is going to be an improvement. Mm-hmm. That's one possibility. Another possibility is weight loss. Not everybody loses weight loss, but probably most do. And if you go to the Hippocrates Institute and you look at the people there, they are all extremely thin. Mm-hmm. So then you're going back to the idea of calorie restriction being a really important factor. Tom Seyfried feels that it's that it's essential. Actually, I think some degree of calorie control, as I said in my presentation. This is not a weight gain diet. I don't think that a ketogenic diet is healthy if you're able to gain weight on it. There's something wrong there. And anyway, that would be my thoughts on that therapy. And I don't see people do the Gerson thing. And very few people actually see a resolution of their cancer. They see a temporary slowdown in the progression. So I think there is something similar to that. That was a good question. Thank you.
It is a really good question, and it makes me think about the use of plant toxins as pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, they do have toxic properties, and if you can get them to the cancer cells, which sometimes can be difficult, you might need to use high doses, or you might need to compound the plant chemical with something else that helps absorption. But in any case, plant toxins have been used for a long, long time to treat various diseases. And I think that they do have potential in that regard, just like chemotherapy can be helpful for cancer. So it makes perfect sense to me that some people would benefit. But just to say, and I know you didn't ask this, but just to say that I do think it's a very different thing to try a potentially toxic substance and exploit its toxic properties when you are in a situation where you need help and you have a disease. That's very different than recommending that people take something toxic every day to prevent a disease. And I think that's where I think a lot of people make that leap, and I think that's a really common way of thinking about it, but I do think they're two different things, sort of like asking people to take chemotherapy every day to prevent cancer.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That's a good analogy. Yeah. Thank you.
This isn't my question. I just wanted to throw it in. You know, once a year in North Carolina, there's a huge herbal symposium called Medicines from the Earth, and it goes into the use of botanicals for cancer. That's one of the things. It's not exclusive, but it's a great field to explore. And in terms of toxicity, I always feel everything's toxic. It's always about dose, whether it's water or oxygen or whatever. Anyway, my question is something more simpler. I want to know what everybody's feelings is about dairy. It can be, I know, Miriam, you went into some detail there. How do you use it? Why do you stay away from it if you do? But specifically, I'm going to start with Peter. And this would be about the follow-up to the estrogen. What do you think about, from what you know, what do you think about growth, bovine growth hormone, or any of the other hormone supportive, we'll call it, do we call them pharmaceuticals, or drugs that are used as kind of common day for dairy production? And do you think that is there such a thing of not having that? And if there is, let's say raw milk without that. I don't know enough about that. I know that it's an issue, and we feel in this other alternative way of looking at it that's sort of, I won't say carcinogenic, but not great to use. Do you have any feelings about that? Or you say, it's been over publicized and not worth going?
So from a personal point of view, my wife Nancy has a sensitivity to dairy that manifests itself as congestion, not as a digestive upset. So it took us a while to figure that out, and for a while ghee would work, and then ghee wouldn't work anymore. She couldn't tolerate it. So by all means, we should be observing ourselves and finding what does and doesn't agree with us. Cheese is fine for me. Except that I have to watch out for, the sort of control. It's easy for me to eat an awful lot of calories very quickly in cheese. And it's the same thing with nuts. I mean, this is not a handful of nuts, right? Right. Somebody last night talked about taking the jar back to your seat and calling that a serving. So beyond that, to your question about the recombinant bovine somatotropin. There is growth hormone in milk as well as other hormonal compounds. If someone's concerned about that, that's, I suppose, legitimate, except that there are hormones in every foodstuff except for Wonder Meat. I mean, of course, we'll sure that they'll get that right, just like margarine. So these are substances that are around, but as you said, dose makes the medicine or the poison. As far as, I don't know if you mentioned antibiotic residue, let me just say that if we're dealing with a commercial channel of production, every tank car rolling up to the dairy is sampled with some quick test, and there's a screen of antibiotic residues that they're looking for. And if it exceeds whatever the threshold is for sensitivity, the entire truckload is discarded before it's ever unloaded into the dairy, and then they go looking for the dairy that produced that, because they're about to get fined heavily. So it doesn't mean that there's no antibiotic residue. It means that they're there below some level that has been established as a threshold. So I see a whole lot of advertisement and label claims that essentially end up being a wash. So that's, again, I'm not concerned about that, although fluid milk has been off my diet for a while. But then, I've been enjoying the heavy cream in my coffee while I've been here. So did that?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I appreciate that. Any other takers on any aspect of using dairy or staying away from dairy?
I do not like ultra-pasteurization and not a big fan of pasteurization. I don't love homogenization. I would refuse to eat ultra-pasteurization. One of the things with pasteurization is that you're burning the proteins that are holding the nutrients. So you reduce bioavailability of nutrients significantly, like at least a third in many of the cases. And so you kind of lose, like, what's the point? You want to be nourished. It's meant to be a nourishing food. Dairy has these wonderful things like potassium, calcium, and that's good. And of course, dairy is delicious and addictive. For me personally, I use very metered doses of heavy cream, some hard cheeses, and raw A2 milk. I don't believe dairy every day is a good idea, so I always try to limit myself to like 4 days a week max, or just take vacations from dairy. I've taken long vacations from dairy in my 8 years of veganism and in my many years of suspecting a dairy allergy. And I could never figure out, could I tolerate this or not? I mean, because I got symptoms and mucus or whatever. Dairy is very helpful in the oxalate situation. It's a wonderful food nutritionally if you digest it well, but I think the quality of the product is critical in dairy, as it should be in food generally.
In a clinical setting, using a well-formulated ketogenic diet, I have a lot of people who eat and drink dairy. I look at it in terms of the number of grams of total carbohydrates. And the paleo folks, of course, Lauren Cordain puts a slide up and shows a moose and says, "Are you going to go milk that sucker?" as the rationale for not having dairy on paleo. Well, I don't think that's very scientific. I mean, but that's the face validity of it. It just wasn't around and all that. But if you have a sensitivity, I wanted to pull up a old-time remedy that needs some science behind it. It's called the rotation diet. It was developed by Bill Philpott, and the idea was that we develop sensitivities after repeated exposures, just don't have the same food but once every 3 days or less frequent. And in his experience, there were fewer food sensitivities. So if you are sensitive to dairy, you might find that you can have dairy just less frequently.
Yeah, that's very naturopathic, by the way.
Oh, I might be an honorary naturopath.
Hey, pushing it, we'll see.
Dairy is just, I try to make things simple. It may not sound like I'm trying to make things simple, but I do when I'm working with somebody, I'm trying to make it simple. Yeah. And dairy is an easy one. So if they're not coming into it with telling me that they have a sensitivity, or if they tell me that they have lactose intolerance, that's not an issue with high-fat dairy. So it's just an easy thing. And if they want to shape things over time, then we can shape things over time. But my goal is to get them to eat more fat, fewer carbs, and just the right amount of protein, so I'm going to go for it. I don't like the fact that that's where the toxins in the animal are concentrated, the fat-soluble toxins, so the ones that aren't going to wash out. And that concerns me, but it also concerns me when somebody's losing weight too quickly, that they're dumping too many hormones and toxins. And I've seen people's vitamin D level go way too high, at least temporarily, from too rapid a weight loss. I don't know if anybody else has seen that, but I've seen it a couple of times, and it's concerning.
Anybody else?
Just before I send it down, there's a book called Tamed that I'm just starting to read, and it's looking at 10 species that got domesticated and their effect on humanity. And to the point about dairy consumption, apparently hunter-gatherers that would bring down a female animal that was lactating would in fact go for the udder and enjoy the contents. So that seems, not a sustainable dairy system, but apparently there was some awareness of the product and going for it in that way.
Very cool.
So dairy is really complicated topic in my mind because there are so many different components, And, you know, we are essentially one of the only species that drinks milk beyond weaning. And we are told that we are supposed to do that in order to be healthy, to get, you know, calcium and vitamin D and so forth. But that argument aside, it's one of the top 9 sensitivity and allergy culprits, so a lot of people are sensitive to dairy in various different ways. For some people it's digestive, for some people it's skin or acne problems, for some people it's chronic pain, like musculoskeletal pain, or migraines, et cetera. It just depends on the person. And then beyond that, there's the fact that whey protein raises insulin levels just as much as refined carbohydrates do. So especially whey protein itself, when separated from the rest of the milk, can spike insulin levels, and athletes take advantage of that. The other thing to say is that as a psychiatrist working with a lot of young women with binge eating and bulimia, there are only 2 things, and I've interviewed many young women about their eating habits over the years, 2 things that people binge on, carbohydrates and dairy. So I do find that for some people, dairy is very addictive. And for me personally, it is. I also happen to be sensitive to it, so luckily I avoid it. But it is, for some people, a trigger food. Something that Dr. Westman has said, which I still borrow quite a lot, is if you can't stop eating it, you better not eat it. So it's just for some people, though.
Very cool.
Yeah, and I would just add to that about the addiction component. In our studies, we found that dairy, cheese in particular, tends to be very high in terms of the addiction scale and how addictive it can be. And again, you know, when we look at what the most addictive food was in our studies, it was pizza. So that's really the combination of the 2 things that Georgia just pointed out, carbohydrates and dairy, cheese and, you know.
Very cool. Thank you all.
Yep.
I just want to add one more thing. I think that there are actually opiate-like receptors in the brain for casein.
Yeah. Casomorphines and glutamorphine. Well, obviously not the glutamorphines, but yeah. A2 milk was a big point, but thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hello. I came here, I thought ketogenic diet was low carb, high fat, and medium protein. And after today, and after hearing your diet, it's all about meat. You described yourself as eating meat only. So can you elaborate a little bit? I mean, I thought we should eat a moderate amount of protein.
Well, I'll excuse myself from this because I'm not following a ketogenic diet, so you shouldn't listen to what I'm saying as an example of what to eat. Okay. But I did eat some vegetables.
I do have concerns about overconsumption of protein, not just for cancer, but in the as we get older. I think that there can be some issues with overconsuming protein. I think it's fine up through midlife. And higher protein has been shown to be associated with better fertility. But, you know, I wasn't designed to live as long as I've lived so far. And I hope to get a whole lot further down the road. And so I do limit the amount of protein, and I suggest that my clients do too. So we're not at a consensus point here as far as the amount of protein. I like the fact that there's different views because it stimulates the discussion and it'll sharpen our questions and it will target our answers. But at this point, for cancer and for aging, I don't believe we should be consuming. I would rather see the consumption of higher fat and moderate or just adequate amounts of protein.
Yeah, like the diet says.
I think you may be confused. Are you talking about percent of protein of the daily calories or grams of protein? Because I eat very low grams of protein, but it's high percentage of the calories I eat relative to other people. So we worry in the medical world about people eating lots of grams of protein, the amount, not the percent amount.
The reason I asked the question is because I came in thinking low carb, high fat, moderate protein. And after today, I feel like, wow, they're all saying we have to eat a lot of protein. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to say, like you say, no. So I didn't have any percentage or grams in mind. It's just a feeling that got carried by the various presentation that protein. But no, I thought it was just moderate protein.
So meat isn't just protein. It's fat and protein, and then we can vary that by cut or addition, whatever we'd like to do. The one thing that I've picked up, and I forget where I got this awareness, but it's really unhelpful. Protein is something in a human being that should target an amount. And a lot of people talk about percent of calories from protein. And if your total caloric intake varies, then that means you're not going to be hitting whatever that target is chosen for whatever reason, right? 10% of calories from protein at 2,000 calories is going to be very different than at 1,500 or 3,000. And so my understanding is that there's a specific amount that we need, and there are opinions that vary on that. And that should be the target, and then the rest can kind of float around that. The other thing is I like the idea if you want to burn fat, your own, if you want to lose fat, then it's best to burn your own rather than eat a lot of fat. So that would shift things too, depending on where you are in your personal journey. And it doesn't mean that that's a forever thing, but it's for that time.
Were you expecting us to say we eat sticks of butter? That's the ketogenic diet stereotype for children.
Yeah.
They actually feed sticks of butter.
Yeah, I kind of thought that you were going to say this. I add a lot of coconut oil to my whatever I eat, and yeah, I was expecting a little bit of this, at least to those who are on a ketogenic diet. So yeah.
Did you have
surprise?
Huh?
I most of the time eat a mostly meat ketogenic diet, by which I usually do limit my protein grams. But before I come back to that to explain more why I do that and the pluses and minuses of that, I just want to say that I think in the community there is a huge debate going on right now, as you're pointing out, about how much protein we need. If we limit protein in a ketogenic diet, are we doing ourselves harm? So I think there are different questions wrapped up in that. So one is, and I think Dr. Westman and Mimi touched on this a little bit. So what is the ideal amount of protein if you are a growing child, if you are a pregnant woman, if you are a performance athlete, if you're trying to optimize performance, versus the ideal amount of protein if you're trying to optimize your metabolic health, lose weight, or for longevity, and for treatment of metabolic disease. So I think those are two completely different questions. And I heard someone say, I wish I could remember who this was, at a recent conference, that those two things may be at odds with each other. That the diet that optimizes your performance may not be the same diet as the diet that optimizes your longevity. So there may be two different answers to the question. But for myself, I'm 53, and I'm not trying to reproduce at the moment, so I
like the at the moment.
Things can change. Keep your options open. So, and I have insulin resistance, and I was overweight as a child, and I, sort of deal with that now with through diet. So I do limit my protein more along the lines of how Miriam talks about it. Between 60 to 80 grams per day, depending on how active I am, and that keeps me in ketosis, and I do check my ketones periodically to make sure, to kind of keep me accountable about that, because it'll creep up if I don't watch it. I will say I did something quietly, interestingly, a couple of months ago. I've heard online that if you eat an all-meat diet, which I don't usually do, if you eat an all-meat diet, that you can eat more protein and still stay in ketosis. So I thought, well, that's interesting. I wish I could do that. I wish I could eat more protein. So I tried that for a couple of weeks, and it was true that I could stay in ketosis and eat a lot more protein than when I was including some plants. I don't know why that is, but I find it fascinating. I don't know if it was just a fluke. I may try it again, but I think that's one of those questions we don't know I don't feel like I know the answer to about protein.
I might just add, I'm not a metric kind of person. I don't count, measure, add, because I have a long history of being in nutrition. I have a good sense about food and what I'm eating and portion sizes and what's in my food. because that's what I trained in. But I kind of go with the idea that periodically, sort of frequently, starving the body of some protein is good. You know, that whole autophagy idea. Make the body start seeking out protein internally when, you know, take out the garbage. And so I let myself or encourage myself, you know, hopefully once a week or whatever, but about once a week to have a real low protein day. And it could end up just being a fasting day. And then, you know, when I feel like eating a big plate of greasy meat, I'm okay with that. I love to eat, and I think the more overly picky you get about the rules, the more you ruin the culinary genius of eating. I'm a culinary eater, so I think sweating it. I think, personally, I feel like if I take my low protein day at least once a week, then I'm cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not that tall. No. I've already kind of tossed this question out to Georgia, and I think it applies to Eric and Miriam, but I don't want to be exclusive, so the rest of you please chime in. But I just did my 23andMe data, and I'm a holistic nutritionist. I teach a ketogenic diet, and I came up ApoE44. So I'm having to get real smart on what changes I'm going to have to make. You know, I know what changes I have to make, but I got to get really smart and deep into it. So I wanted to ask you guys your opinion on that, some of the changes. Is it just like with the rest of what I'm thinking initially is with the rest of the ketogenic diet, it's how do you react with everything as in the diet, and I know the genotype, and what's my blood work looking like? What's my HDL, my LDL, my calcium score, those types of things. So if you could expound on that.
I think that's an important marker, and Georgia's going to address that, I'm sure. She's had a lot more interaction with Dale Bredesen and that group that looks at that. I think what my contribution here is, I think it's really wise to start looking at all of these different ways to improve lifestyle, not just about diet. So all of those things, if you read Dale Bredesen's book, he's looking at you know, other things, lifestyle factors as well, certain supplements and certain fats. And I don't know how important the cholesterol thing is. I think it's really overblown. But calcium score is a good idea. But I mean, just keep working towards improving lifestyle, getting toxins out of the environment, and you know, I think you already do a good job of that, of awareness of that. So you're certainly on the right track, but there's always room for a little bit of improvement, tweaking here and there.
Remind me why we're worried about ApoE4.
Well, that's what I want to get. It's, you know, Miriam knows me fairly well, so she knows how I live and stuff, and I'm not really all that worried about it. But now that I know in the last week that I actually am a 4-4, you know, do I get rid of this saturated fat completely, or do I just kind of see, according to my blood work and thing, if I'm doing good, I'm good?
No, time out. Where did it come from, the ApoE4?
Oh, 23andMe.
Oh. No, where did the concern come from?
Me.
No, the Alzheimer's.
Yeah, Alzheimer's and the cardiovascular are part of it. So the Alzheimer's and the cardiovascular disease part of it.
And carb eaters.
Yes.
Who have insulin resistance from eating carbs.
And the insulin resistance.
So
and
we're going to
smoking.
deal with a lot of noise from diseases defined by those who eat carbohydrates that don't occur when you don't eat carbohydrates. This is the uncharted water, the promise of a keto lifestyle that's not realized yet. But that means you can ignore all that, because that was determined under the conditions of eating carbohydrates. You can ignore it if you don't eat carbohydrates.
Perfect.
That's my stance when someone comes in who really shouldn't be on a statin. I mean, you know, they're 20 years old and the doctor wants to put them on. They have no heart disease anywhere near. I mean, it's irrational to put someone on that statin at that age without any, big risk. And so I'll just bring out statins really haven't even been tested in people who don't eat carbohydrates. Might even harm you. However, I relent, at least, that if there's a lot of evidence among carb eaters that statins reduce heart disease after you've had a heart attack, and we've talked about this with a couple people this weekend, that, you know, the discretion is the better part of valor, and also I can't quite be quite the quack if I'm going to still be in the mainstream medical world at a medical university. So anyway, I don't worry. So if you showed me a study where you could alter the diet and something based on the ApoE4 in a prospective manner, and you reduced those diseases, this is called evidence-based medicine, and you hold out for the experiment, then I'd say I'm worried about it. Right now, I'm not worried about it.
Anybody else? So we talked a little bit, and there was a piece we didn't address, but so ApoE4, for people who don't know what that is, so it's if you have 2 copies of the ApoE4 gene, then you have what some papers like to refer to as the warrior gene, which means that we were all ApoE4, E4, but 2 copies of the E4 a long time ago, and then gradually some of us adapted to a newer sort of post-agricultural lifestyle, and we developed other types of ApoE called 2 or 3. So some people are 2-2, some people are 2-3, etc. So people who are ApoE4 apparently appear to have, in epidemiological studies, higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so a lot of people think of ApoE4 as the Alzheimer's gene, which I think is really unfortunate. Yes, there's an association, but that association, I think it makes sense to think about it as ApoE4 is the gene combination that we had back when we were eating a pre-agricultural diet. And so if you eat that diet for that genotype, it should be fine. But the other piece of that puzzle is that, so I think that people with ApoE4 may be more susceptible to the diseases that are due to modern dietary patterns. That's a hypothesis. I don't know if that's true, but it makes sense in my mind. The other thing is that some people who study ApoE4 and Alzheimer's say that you should avoid saturated fat. I haven't dug into that literature as much as I need and want to yet, but my suspicion is that I just can't imagine that saturated fat natural saturated fat is a risk factor for any modern disease. It doesn't make sense to me. And maybe it is, but it wouldn't make sense to me. But dairy fat is another question. So I had some people come up and talk to me at Low Carb San Diego after I gave my Alzheimer's presentation to talk to me about ApoE4, and I don't know a lot about it, quite honestly, but what some people said to me was, well, I cut down on saturated fat and my numbers improved, my cholesterol panel improved. They weren't just talking about LDL, they were talking about overall. And so I said to them, well, did you remove dairy or did you lower all saturated fat? And I even asked Richard Gundry if he had looked at the difference between the effects of dairy saturated fat and other types of saturated fat. And I don't think that he has done that. So that's my curiosity, is saturated fat from dairy is very different from saturated fat, from other types of other animal foods. So does that make any sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I just needed to be slapped with it a little bit. But it does, because I know the data is from diabetics, insulin-resistant people, and smokers that are really that's who gets affected by it. But I didn't, with your experience, if there was anything more. So.
Well, one of my patients came in with the 23andMe, and the printout was, you should go on a low-fat diet. And it's because the LDL was high.
Yeah.
So if you're going to, you didn't say there was a recommendation in the 23andMe, but if you're going to be getting a recommendation from the people who consulted the current opinion leaders who will tell you to reduce saturated fat for anything, and that's just outdated.
Yeah.
So that's too bad that some of those companies will present recommendations and not just the data about the genes. That would be, because the recommendations will change.
Right.
Or it might be wrong.
Yeah, and it makes complete sense what you're saying. So thank you.
Before we move on to the next question, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to excuse myself because I have to head to the airport. But I just wanted to thank everyone for staying and for the wonderful questions and discussion, and for the other speakers as well. And thanks to Doug and Pam for having me.
So Nicole, as you're leaving, was pizza really more addictive than ice cream? It was. Wow.
It was.
Pizza.
Pizza comes first and then you have ice cream after.
I have a question for Dr. Eid probably, but you guys can all weigh in, which is I get a lot of pushback when I tell people to stop drinking whey protein shakes because, you know, they're so good for you. And then the next question is always, can I bake with it? Because so many of these low-carb recipes have whey protein acting as a flour. And my general thing is do what I say and please don't eat them. But I actually want to be able to make sure that they're getting the full answer. Do you know if there's a difference if you cook with whey protein versus drinking a whey protein shake?
I don't happen to know. Does anybody else know?
Or am I asking, is it better to get like shot in the right leg or the left leg?
I mean, there could be. There could be a difference if the proteins and the factors in whey that activate our IGF levels and insulin levels, growth factor levels, if those are denatured through the cooking process. But I don't know if the isolation of the whey protein itself already has denatured. I honestly don't know, but it's a great question. Does anybody else?
No. I forget the name of the blogger. He appeared for a while and then went away, but he had a line that resonates with me and our story, and he talked about smoking candy cigarettes. and I understand the desire to find these sort of replacement baked goods, cookies, whatever, and we certainly went down that path.
Right.
And in retrospect, looking back at some of the ingredients we were using, it's like, oh my goodness, what were we thinking? So for some people, there may be yet another reason to avoid the whole faux or replacement foods that are meant to be, from another part of my life, the near beer experience, right? So if you want to stop, and maybe that would be helpful, but no to the specific question.
There's a huge difference between a protein shake and the amount of protein that goes into
It's true.
a baked
It's a much
good.
smaller.
So if you now I know people that are sensitive to even just 2 or 3 grams of whey, but the research has been done with boluses of 20 or 25. So even without being able to directly answer your question about whether it would be denatured in some way that would make it less
poisonous
problematic.
in the quantity.
Don't know that, but if you look at the amount of total protein and how much of that is whey protein in a serving of the product, you're probably okay.
Okay. And on the same lines, other types of powdered protein I assume are similarly bad, but is whey protein just the worst? Or is there a type of powdered protein you don't have a big issue with?
I don't have an issue with vegan proteins, and I'm not a plant-based person at all. But I don't have an issue with those in terms of, I don't know what they are as far as oxalates go, but then you're not dealing with the whey factor at all. It's the anabolic thing, and it's a true thing, and that's why athletes like whey protein.
Right. And most of my clients are not athletes. Okay, thank you.
I just wish they'd recognize that powdered protein is a processed food.
Yeah.
It's not food, and it's not to be trusted. It may have even carcinogenic potential.
Absolutely.
So, if it's in a plastic can, it's not really food.
My answer is always don't do it, and I like to explain more about the why. So yeah, absolutely. All right, thanks guys.
Miriam, you mentioned about the repurposing drugs, the meprobamate and the statin and the anti-malarial or the antiparasitic and the doxy in our breakout session, as well as I think you mentioned it also here. I guess I'm wondering how, and you used it with your son, I believe, how do you know how to rotate those drugs? You use them all at once, off for a month, on a month? Do you look them up in PubMed? I mean, none of the oncologists are, they meprobamate they recommend now, but the others, I don't know how to sequentially do that.
Yeah. Care Oncology UK is the people that are using that particular protocol of 4 drugs, and they keep the metformin as a press therapy, they keep the statin as a press therapy, and then they alternate. They do 2 months of mebendazole and 1 month of the doxy. And then it starts again with, they just rotate those 2. Now, my son was in a trial, Dana-Farber 5-drug trial, and they had a statin drug in that. And they had thalidomide, that's a great anti-angiogenic, as we unfortunately know. And then they rotated a couple of chemo drugs, and there was a COX-2 inhibitor in there too. So there have been combination therapies that have been tried. That particular one didn't work for my son at all. But this one that Care Oncology is doing in South Dakota, Travis Christofferson, he found a doctor that people can meet with there in South Dakota, and they can get the script for these drugs. They're only $50 a month. It's an amazingly inexpensive regimen, and people, I'm really happy when one of my clients is doing it. I can't advocate for it in the same way I advocate for the diet. It's not my job, but I really support what they're doing.
You'll give me that reference, or?
Yeah, sure, I can get that. Just send me a reminder email,
and then
I'll give you a link.
what do you mean by press therapy? What did you mean?
One that would be continuous.
Continuous.
When Dr. Seyfried talks about press, pulse, there's some things that are press, where you keep them steady, and then there's other things that you pulse in that might inhibit glutamine or might inhibit another pathway that you want to shut down. And that's how we're going to manage cancer and hopefully cure cancer using less toxic and more effective therapies in these combinations.
And hyperbaric, you never
I don't think there's enough evidence. There's that one mouse model study, and that's great that they did that. That was a combination therapy there. It was hyperbaric oxygen, ketogenic diet, a ketone supplement, and have I got it all there? Anyway, the mice that were doing the combination therapy did so much better. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure one mouse outlived the end of the actual intervention. But I would look into that. I'd look into what they're doing in South Dakota. If I had cancer, this is what I would be doing. I would be looking at combination therapies that are less toxic and possibly just as effective or more effective. And there's science behind it. There's a reason why the antiparasitic mebendazole is going to have an effect in cancer. And it's for the same reason that the alkaloids like vincristine and vinblastine are going to have an effect in cancer. But there's less of the toxicity. It's just we got to dial in how to put these things together.
Right. Thank you.
So insulin resistance, it's one of those things we talk about. I'm good. Okay, thanks. It's one of those things we talk about. So collectively, if you could sort of define it for you, say what its importance is to you, or maybe it's not important. And do you think it's one of those things that can change over time, where we've just sort of been stamped with it? It's got a coefficient of insulin that comes from our liver, and that's it. Mine's different than yours, and yours is different than whoever, but it's not a changing coefficient or relationship. So is that too loaded, but just insulin resistance?
I think we can each address that one.
Yeah.
Well,
I think so.
in a obesity, weight loss, and diabetes clinic, it's huge. So the abdominal obesity, the story is abdominal obesity is the major cause of insulin resistance, and carbs then create more insulin resistance by making you secrete more insulin, which then your cells can't listen to. I heard a MIT scientist at Low Carb, it was in Tampa, the second annual Tampa meeting. He modeled the human metabolism and said, I can explain insulin resistance entirely by the amount of carbohydrate put into the body, meaning that it was driven by the carbs that someone ate. Now, in a clinical setting, as I show you can improve glycemic control and insulin pretty quickly by cutting carbs out in most people. But if there is this abdominal obesity, then you might not get perfect glycemic control until that insulin resistance is gone. Absolutely, you can fix insulin resistance in the context of obesity and carb eating. Now, there may be other factors that cause insulin resistance that don't seem to be as important at first, and that's where you look at other factors that, you know, that seem to be really small in compared to just the carbs. You know, so just cut the carbs, and insulin resistance gets better.
Cool. Thanks, Eric.
So insulin resistance in my world, the cancer world, is probably one of the biggest lifestyle contributors to cancer, in that it's layered on over decades, and it's an accumulation of adipose tissue, and the adipose tissue is secreting inflammatory cytokines and holding hormones and what was the other thing with? Oh, secreting estrogen. It's an estrogen-producing organ, and we don't need that kind of production of estrogen coming from fat storage. So, and like I said, it gets layered on over decades. I see this so consistently with people I work with. It's like in the 20s and 30s, they keto adapt almost instantly. You're getting into the 40s and 50s, it's a little harder. People at 60s and 70s, I don't think they're ever really, if they come to me with insulin resistance already, I don't think they're ever going to get it totally resolved, but they can still be healthy by lowering the carbs. It is all about the carbs. Just get them out of there, and you're not going to be continuing to layer it on over the decades.
Sally?
Tell me why we're talking about this again. So I
It's
speak
kind of the
to
heart of the ketogenic diet. It's kind of one of the co-ideas. Why we're talking about it?
the
So
co-idea is about the
blood sugar control, insulin, ketone bodies. So it's not exactly.
I'm not a
oxalating
ketone
related.
person, but I consider insulin like this ambulance running through the streets screaming all the time, and the cells are, you know, being barraged to do something they no longer know how to do, which is get rid of the glucose, right? And that's a pretty horrible place to be if you live in that world where the ambulances are screaming all the time. And if you drop the carbs and try to reduce that pressure, cell communication should eventually right itself if nutritionally we're providing the right fats and other materials you need to rebuild proper cell membranes. Those receptors on those cells require the right fats in the membranes, and you need the right balance of nutrients. So if you're still eating corn oil and junk like that, I think that is going to hold the process of cell communication being poor, the process of those proteins in the cell membranes not fully functioning well. And of course, you need your micronutrients. You need minerals to keep all those ion exchangers happy. So, and of course, you need a lot less oxalate and other toxins that are throwing muck into this cell communication stuff.
Good.
I'm not that kind of doctor.
You got something here.
Cows have insulin too.
Well, they do, and that would be a fascinating, geeky segue. But as I just tried to say, as that little soil fertility, as far as I can tell, it's the short stave. It's the greatest insult to the greatest number of people if we're looking at population kinds of things. It makes sense to start there and then keep our eyes open for what else it could be. But somebody once explained to me as I was trying to learn how to fix my car, if the car stops as I'm going down the road, the first thing to do is to see if there's gas in the tank before I start to, tear down the engine. And so this just seems to be, from what I can see, again, that growing list of chronic illnesses that are plausibly linked to hyperinsulinemia is for me, it's, and I don't, the people in this room have heard type 3 diabetes. I know for certain, for fact, of some very intelligent people working at universities in other disciplines that haven't heard that yet. So that's just an indication that needs to be focused on more.
Okay. Do you, in this vein, but specifically with dairy, hence your field, you can say dairy, insulin resistance, dairy, insulin.
It's a story about how you have the same breed of cows, so same largely genotype, except one strain is in New Zealand and another strain is in North America. And in New Zealand, primarily pasture-based, but sometimes you might want to feed a little grain. They figured out some years ago that there was a pretty consistent displacement. You fed so much grain, the animal would eat so much less pasture. And that had to be they had to be careful with that for obvious reasons. They're pasture-based. And that number was consistent over time, but they kept checking. And then they realized that that number was diminishing for some reason. And I think it was diminishing. In any case, it was changing after being stable for a long time. So they went looking, and what it was it was coming closer to what the North American displacement figure was. And what they figured after looking into it some more was they figured that the North American Friesian had been selected for insulin resistance. And that germplasm, if you will, had been incorporated into the New Zealand herd. So that's all that was about.
Very cool, though.
So insulin resistance affects the brain as well as the body. So as goes the body, so goes the brain. And so Peter was touching on that. So, and it affects the brain in a little bit differently than it affects the rest of the body, because it's not that insulin can't get into the brain the way insulin has a hard time getting it. You know, it's not that glucose can't get into the brain the way in the rest of the body glucose can't get into the cells easily if you have insulin resistance. It's that insulin can't get into the brain as easily. And if the insulin can't get into the brain as easily, then you can't burn all that glucose that the brain needs for its cells to operate properly. So, paradoxically, ironically, the more sugar you eat, the higher your blood sugar level, the higher your insulin level, the less your brain is getting to eat. So it's very interesting the way that works. So it is true now that people are referring to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes, because insulin resistance seems to be a primary driving factor for most garden variety cases of Alzheimer's disease. But that type 3 diabetes is a very interesting term, because if you really look at all these different diseases that are connected to insulin resistance, we have many more than 3 types. So, you know, you could have fatty livers, type 4, and cardiac diseases, type 5, and, you know, we could go on and on. But it's just the end stage for the brain of insulin resistance, whereas diabetes is the end stage of insulin resistance for the body, and so forth. So, and I agree with everyone else who mentioned this, that it's a chronic, progressive, completely preventable, completely manageable condition through diet. But the longer you let it go, the harder it is. So once you develop cancer or Alzheimer's disease, it's much more difficult to treat those things with diet than it is to treat the earlier stages. I don't know if other people would agree with that, the clinicians, but that's how I see it anyway.
Super, thanks.
Yeah.
So, clinical question. I have a number of mostly women, when they start to go ketogenic after a couple of months with the natural appetite suppression, they eat less and less and less, and then many are eating just one meal a day, maybe one other small meal a day, and some of them sort of get stuck weight-wise. And you know, I have them send me my Fitness Pal, and I know for sure that they really aren't eating much, and they're not hungry, and they're eating relatively good formulations of what they're eating, and there's no carb creep. Any thoughts on that?
Did you say, are they in ketosis?
I told you I don't check, so yeah.
That's my first step.
Yeah.
Ah, you wrote all these things down. Well, I will even pull one out at the clinic. Spot check. So the best marker of adherence in a keto diet in a clinic for weight loss is weight loss. Adherence, weight loss. Hunger going away suggests adherence, but I had a family friend who didn't divulge that he was having Oreos in the middle of the night to me before he said your diet didn't work in front of a cocktail party, much to my embarrassment. And so a lot of people think they're doing it and they're not. And so I'll use ketone checks. Some argue that you should do the ketone measurements initially in everyone as a tool. I don't do that. I use it as a secondary thing. But then, let's say that they're in ketosis. So ketosis doesn't mean you're going to burn. Ketosis means fat burning. It doesn't mean fat loss. And so basically you have to get the caloric balance. Yeah, I know, no one wants to talk about caloric balance, but it's still there. It's just kind of complicated. So, what's going to happen is especially in those who exercise a lot, your metabolic rate's going to go down. That was in the Biggest Loser essay in the New York Times. It's normal adaptation. It's not abnormal. And so, yeah, some metabolisms go way down. And if all you're going to do, especially postmenopausal women who are in our clinics in spades, if you're just going to rely on the diet change, so you're sedentary and you want this to work magic, then you have to cut the calories down. I do it informally by, just eat one meal a day. If you want to call it intermittent fasting, great. And all sorts of things like cognitive things like, are you eating out of hunger or out of habit? Are you eating because of the time of day or because you're truly hungry? And plateaus exist; they occur, but usually it's carb creep, and people are eating because they're going out to lunch with their friends and things. But I guess my first step would be to check the ketones.
So quick question about that before we move on. I had heard that sometimes when you're keto adapted for a long period of time, you won't actually see ketones in the urine. Is that not true?
Well, in some people, but I would say 90% of the time it's fine. So how you measure the ketones is a whole nother question. Some people have the ketone breath meter, some have the blood meter, some have the urine, and I'll start with the urine. In our area, it's more affordable, and in most people it works.
I would be looking at, you're fairly certain that there's no carb creep. Have the portions or the servings of nuts increased? So that would be one thing I'd just throw out there. Cut the nuts out and cut the dairy out, because I find that dairy can hold weight on people, and I think it probably has to do with the anabolic effect, insulin signaling, whatever it's doing, it's holding weight on people. So if you cut the dairy for a couple of weeks, they don't have to do it forever, and make sure they're limiting the amounts of nuts, maybe put them in portion-sized bags or something.
I've done the nuts, but I haven't tried the dairy yet.
Yeah,
so
cut
that might be.
cut definitely. Yeah, I bet you'll see some results from that. Let me know.
I like the discussion about eating out of habit, but it's a really big topic, because the way we build our day, our transition from being at home to going to work to coming back, food is all part of how we structure our day. And so you're really mucking with people's whole sense of how life is and what day of the week it is and all of that, and that gives them emotional stability. And you take those markers mentally out of their day, and they feel kind of lost. So I think the emotional, mental piece is a process, and could be multi-year process. And I would encourage people to be patient with learning that you don't always have to eat because it's dinner time, and feeling what that's like, and maybe doing some journaling and finding someone in their life who's sympathetic to talk about what this transition is like, so they don't feel so isolated in that. It's kind of weird, to just destroy your sense of how a day should go. And that's a big deal. So I would really work to be empathetic and compassionate about that, because I think our Dr. Eric is right about the habit of eating. You just eat because that's what I feel like I need to do, but I'm not doing it for my physical self. I'm doing it for the other aspects of myself, which are dominating. But I would like to share a story of one client. I don't have a whole lot of clients this has happened for, but then a lot of people come to me are health nuts and they're not heavy. But she struggled with weight and addictive overeating for decades, and in her 70s. And the low oxalate diet was her breakthrough. And in 3 or 4 months, she dropped like 40 pounds or more. I can't remember the number, but it was, to her, a real miracle. And I am of the belief that a lot of toxins end up around fat tissue, and if the system's not healthy enough to process toxins, that might be stirring up, because when you lose weight, you get hemorrhoids and other signs of toxicity. You are stirring up some muck. And So I would definitely make sure she's not overdoing oxalates, or all your patients should not be overdoing oxalates. It's not going to help. There was one other thing I was going to mention about this, but I think weight loss isn't a straight line. You know, life is not a straight line, and it's not pretty, and it doesn't look good on a chart always. But if they're willing to stay committed to their health, that's good. I also think something like sauna is great. I think exercises that jiggle you around or stretch your stuff, like yoga and rebounding and stuff, it's really helpful with the oxalates to move. Especially my kidney stone guys, they really do better if they either do yoga or jump on a trampoline or something. But if you're really toxic, jumping on a trampoline makes you sicker because it does stir up junk. And a long history of bad diet or exposure to weird stuff could be a problem.
Speaking from personal experience, when I've had many weight plateaus in my life on various diets. So on keto, a ketogenic diet, I find that I will gain weight if I include dairy. I find that the sugar substitutes will raise my appetite. I find that exercise makes a big difference. I find that calories matter. For me, as a 53-year-old woman, I can't eat all the fat that I want. And that's okay. It doesn't feel like a hardship. It's just a truth about metabolism sort of slowing down, for lack of a better phrase. And, and for some people, including myself, I mean, in a perfect world, caffeine and alcohol also, because they have an effect on, they sort of destabilize insulin and blood sugar levels, but dairy is a big one, and I would say the sugar substitutes are probably number 2. And this isn't true for everybody, but for people who get stuck, and women tend to get stuck more often than men do. And I think that maybe, this is just a theory, I don't know if this is right, but I feel like, women are more sensitive and more responsive to hormonal cues because of pregnancy. So we have to be constantly monitoring the environment for hormones. We may be more sensitive to the hormones in dairy because we're listening all the time to see what we're supposed to be doing internally. So men may not have those types of, may not be so exquisitely, may not need to listen so carefully to their internal systems because of those differences reproductively. That's the best I can do in terms of the why are women more susceptible.
I hate to tell you this, Georgia. On average, our metabolism slows down 100 calories per day per decade. So if you were eating the same amount as you did 20 years ago, you would be putting on 200 calories a day extra weight because your metabolism on average slows down. So that's why older people eat less, but naturally. And
yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Is it true for keto? Great question. As someone who said we're comparing apples to oranges and so many things. No data on keto. So the best data that from Ludwig's group at Harvard was that metabolism slows down on keto, but not as much as on a mixed diet with carbohydrate. And we have one study, so we need many more.
So I very much appreciate you saying that because I think we're saying the same thing, but I used the wrong terminology. So when I said, so to speak, what I mean is, and I would love your input on this, everybody, is that for me it feels like, I'm referring more to how much carbohydrate and food I can get away with over time. So, and that probably has more to do with insulin resistance than metabolic rate. So for example, when I was a teenager, I used a low-fat, low-calorie diet because that's what everybody used back in the 70s, and that worked fairly well. I wasn't happy, I was hungry all the time, but that worked to keep my weight in a relatively normal range when I followed it. And then in my 30s, I could do a South Beach low glycemic index diet, and that worked great with some exercise, and that worked. And then when I turned 40, that didn't work anymore, and I had to do low-carb, high-fat, and now in my 50s, I have to do ketogenic. So I feel like something is changing, and it's probably insulin resistance, and that's what I mean by metabolism. I absolutely agree with you that it's not about that it's not about metabolic rate per se, because the studies don't show that, but something keeps changing. I don't know what it is.
I think it is metabolic rate.
Oh,
I mean,
you
that's
do?
a possibility, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Not so much carbohydrate sensitivity or insulin resistance, meaning I have to keep lowering my carbs as I get older and older.
Both.
Okay.
Sorry. Both.
No, that's all right.
Well, one of my teachers, and I'm sure many of you have met Jackie Eberstein, she's at about 10 grams of carbs a day, total carbs. As an older postmenopausal person who's done this the longest I've known anyone do it. But so yeah, you may have to go even lower. But relish in the wonderful non-carb foods.
Yes. A couple of times a year, I will drop my carb. I generally eat probably, I don't know, I don't track, but I would guess about 40 or 50 grams of carb a day. And except here, much lower. And every once in a while, I'll beta test meals, or I'll do something for somebody, and I'll drop my carbs down to like 12 to 16. And I find that I need a lot more food that normally I can exist on, again, calories, about 1,600 calories, I would guess. But when I've done that, and the meals are 1,600 calories, sort of adapted for me, I've got to go up to 2,200 calories, and I still lose a couple pounds in a couple weeks. So I don't know what's going on with my metabolism there, but I know I'm probably eliminating more ketones, more of the fat, the energy value, through excreting higher levels of ketones. But that can't explain the whole thing. It doesn't make any sense. The calories in, calories. It's not that much of a difference in carbs. I'm still very low carb. I don't know.
I can explain it for you. Well, and even the animal researchers found, much to their surprise, that they had to feed rats and mice more calories if they were on a low-carb diet than the wild-type diet, if they wanted to maintain the weight the same. And this was I said, yeah, duh, we know that in the clinical setting, but the animal researchers had to find that out. So you look at the details of these studies, and they're feeding the low-carb animals more calories if they want to keep the weight the same. So they have to decide, do we want to keep a caloric balance, meaning outside the body calories, how they're measured, or do we want a weight balance? And that's their outcome. They have to decide on that ahead of time. So what happens when you eat low-carb diet foods, predominantly one factor is now if you're not changing your protein, so protein gets metabolized less efficiently and generates heat. So you lose energy that way, so you need to eat more per calorie outside the body. But if all you did is change the carbs down, that wouldn't explain it.
Drop the carbs, raise the fat. It could be insulin, too. It could be that I'm making less insulin.
Making less insulin internally. So it's complicated. The metabolic rate change, some clinics do measure metabolic rate directly. We don't, but we generally explain it that it's just things are different on a low-carb diet. It's like driving on the left-hand side of the road, and not the right-hand side. The rules are different, and you're not going to expect the same things, but that's not very mechanistic.
That's a good answer.
Can I ask you a question? Do you ever recommend high-intensity interval training to these folks?
Most of my patients are not that
capable.
ability. Yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, for some of my younger, more fit ones, I do. But to me, if they go for a walk, I'm pretty happy.
We're from the South. Yeah. It's not culturally
done.
In some populations, it's not part of the culture.
Chapel Hill's not the South. I think a lot of these people who've had a long history of trying to diet have really messed up their metabolism, and it makes it really harder. I have a long history of demolishing all-you-can-eat bars. Was a giant eater. I could eat 5 times what I can eat now when I was a teenager in my early 20s until my oxalates ruined my feet, and I was on crutches and wheelchairs for 8 years, and then I did gain weight. But I think there are different ways to kind of stimulate the metabolism and encourage the body, but encouraging the person to be honest with themselves and to try to grow into this new lifestyle that's hard.
Have you tried Keto OS or exogenous ketone?
Nope, haven't tried it yet.
If the
Well,
company,
they couldn't afford it probably, but.
So if the company would
Right.
donate a whole bunch to me, which they never have, or if they got any clinic to help, that would be a prime area to target to see if you could get someone through a plateau, or just, it might be just you're having them to, you'd want a placebo controlled, but you might be able to do that. Or there is a technique, advanced technique in our low carb keto world called the fat fast.
That's what I recommend.
Yeah.
Or the egg fast.
Or the egg
And
fast.
it seems
and,
to work.
Yeah, it can help. Although you wonder if it's just the tincture of time, but I've never seen a controlled study of the fat fast or egg fast, but sometimes all we do is we just do a little dance so that time will pass and that the body will just keep working.
They also
its
really
way.
want to do something, and they really want
Yeah,
to do
they want you to
something.
do something,
So
yeah.
it seems innocuous enough. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I was doing great until you just blew my mind, Dr. Westman. That if you lose
Again?
if you lose the abdominal fat, you lose the insulin resistance, because I never had abdominal fat. My brother never had abdominal fat. My son never
wait a
had
minute.
abdominal fat.
We all do.
Well, yeah, I mean, but not visible. I mean, it wasn't visible.
That doesn't matter, but go ahead.
No, I mean, maybe I do now. But, but I believed in my 20s when I weighed 109 pounds that I believe it's a familial, is there something, can you talk about familial, genetic, inborn, whatever, because my whole family seems to have issues that I would call related to some sort of innate insulin resistance, whether they are fat or thin, and they go the whole gamut. Yes, I know you always have that there's internal, but it wasn't that there was fat people and there were skinny people, and we all seem to have these horrible things that I have always called insulin resistance. Am I wrong? Is it in the family?
When you ask, is it genetics? Yeah, but it's also environmental.
Yeah.
So you can overcome genetic predisposition. So if all of your family were eating a typical American diet and they all gained weight and they all had insulin resistance, that doesn't mean you can't fix it.
They didn't all gain weight.
Yeah, well, so if what's confusing in America too is that Weight Watchers works for those who don't have insulin resistance. This is the best study was Christopher Gardner at Stanford, where he separated out insulin sensitive, insulin resistance, and the low carb diets work best for those who are insulin resistant. Both diets work if you are insulin sensitive. If I looked at this, if there was only one choice, choose the low carb diet. When other people say, well, no, you can just target those with insulin sensitivity and the low fat diet will work. So the extent to which the abdominal fat contributes to insulin resistance and how low on the weight you have to get to eradicate all, or low in the abdominal fat to eradicate all insulin resistance may be back to your high school or college weight. And what's really cool is I see
weighed
people...
a lot more in high school than I do now.
Well, so
but
again,
it wasn't abdominal fat. I've always put it on in the hips.
So you may be surprised at how much lower you have to go compared to what other doctors say. So, and I guess not knowing your particular example, again, unless there's some other factors in the environment causing insulin resistance, it's generally the carbs and the abdominal fat. Like
so I
check
wasn't
the
born
gas in
with
the
it?
tank.
See, I believe I was born with it. Everyone in my family was born with insulin
Well, wait a minute. Day
resistance.
1, you were in ketosis. Day 2, you were given Gerber or breast milk. You're probably not in ketosis anymore. So then now you're saying when you were 5 years old, you had it. Yeah, maybe, because...
My point is, I just don't believe I will ever not be insulin resistant.
Let's find out.
You really want me to, how... My son was called underweight. He went into Jeffrey Gerber's clinic, and he was diagnosed as underweight. I think he's still insulin resistant. Thin, skinny as a bone. I just think I don't think it is all about abdominal fat. I've never had an abnormal blood sugar. I've never been diagnosed diabetic. But I treat myself as if I am. I think I'm insulin resistant for life.
You have to be, with difficult cases, you have to be a bit of a detective. and you handle things one by one, like the gas in the car. Okay, so the car's not working and the gas tank's full. Then you look for the next thing. You look for the next thing. So not knowing these particular cases, you first, so what I'll say to someone is, oh, I can't lose that much weight. I said, really? Where's your crystal ball? Where, how do you know? Because, well, doctor told me, or, or I just never been there. Well, let's go down that path. And so I've seen people achieve things they never thought were possible, and that's the beauty of this kind of approach.
But I'm basically happy with my health and my well-being.
Oh, we were talking about you?
Everybody in my family. And some of us, are doing very well. Some of us aren't. I told you my sister still has abdominal obesity. But I think, what would I do differently? Because I'm never going to change from a ketogenic diet. And I, just like Georgia, I keep tapering down, tweaking less and less as time goes on. Because I'm 65, my metabolism slowed down. But I think I always have to live as if. Maybe that's my question.
One of the reasons we created Heal Clinics, healclinics.com, is that it gives the time to give a clinical evaluation that any doctor would give, naturopath or MD, DO trained. And how often things come up that we never have time to talk about. What have I picked up? Flonase nasal spray. Well, Flonase nasal spray, how could that happen to cause insulin resistance? Well, it's a steroid. And so anyway, and even some people come in and they're on 10 supplements that they never thought were relevant, and you don't have time to explain here. So you might take the time to see someone if you have an advanced issue. And that's the reason we created this, so that you're not beholden to us jabbing here and there, because it is complicated, and someone has to take the time to listen to the whole story. And while you can't get any more compassionate folks than us up here, we don't have enough time to figure out everything.
And I'm not asking for that, but just finally to say, shouldn't we just act as if? I mean, isn't it, I'm going to live the keto lifestyle believing I'm insulin resistant, and I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to change what I'm doing.
There may be something else.